Hello. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. You are looking and sounding great.
Okay.
Let me give you share screen. Do you have a presentation you'll be sharing?
No, I'm just going to talk.
Cool. I'll still give you share screen in case anything happens. You are
Okay.
a co-host and can drop the ban hammer.
Good.
Cool. All right, you should be a co-host now. I think I'll have 2 more people coming in to help manage the Zoom for us early. Just go double check your introduction before we get going. So I've got this one we posted on all the events. This is still the same bio for your intro I should use?
Yeah, right after Professor of History, I'm also chair of the Africana Studies Department. That just happened at UNC Charlotte. So Professor of History and chair of the Africana Studies Department.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna go put this in another doc so I don't screw that up.
That's the only change.
Perfect. Chair of Africana Studies. Congrats.
Thank you.
Cool. There we go. Make this nice and big so I can't screw it up. All right, awesome. Wonderful, wonderful. Cool. All right, I'm gonna grab a quick snack. I'm trying to think, is there anything else you need?
No, I'm good to go.
Awesome, wonderful. Yeah, usually about 5 to 10 minutes beforehand, I start the live stream on Facebook, put up a little music and a waiting hold thing.
Okay.
We'll get started with probably like 3 to 5 minutes of announcements, very quick, and then we can hop right into your presentation. And then I keep everyone muted through the whole presentation, and then I funnel all the Q&A. So we'll have everyone put everything in chat, and then I will do a Q&A session with you. Pretty much as long as you're willing to go for a Q&A. We've had some people go over an hour, but yeah, so usually we don't go far past like 12:30 usually.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, should be fun. And then people, once we're done with that, we let everyone open their mics up and they can chat with you if they have any direct questions that we really missed. You can also leave at that moment as well. There's really no pressure around any of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm probably gonna have to. We have our new student convocation today.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Head out for that.
Oh boy, God, it's so weird. Everything's rushing back together.
Yeah. Luckily, I mean, it's outside, so. But
yeah,
getting thousands of people together doesn't seem like the best idea right now.
You teaching indoor classes?
Teaching a graduate seminar, so there's only 15 students in it.
Okay.
And we do have a mask mandate, so
Yeah.
And good like 70% of our students are vaccinated, so
Right.
it's not too bad.
I was talking to a high school teacher or a junior high teacher in Sacramento the other day, and she was talking about how like as best as we're doing and as high as the vaccination rates are, it's just like she still feels pretty confident she's probably going to get COVID by the end of the year.
Really?
Really sad, yeah, the way it's spreading right now. Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of what else we need to do. Cool. I think you're good to hang for a few minutes.
Right.
I'm gonna go get some water. I'll be right back. My microphone. Go. Okay. It's not even picking up that mic. That's because that's not plugged in. It's a fancy mic, but I rarely use it. Let's see if I can get it working today. How about now? Is that working? Does that sound better? Cool. Go ahead and talk. See if I'm getting it in my ears as well.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Coming out of that.
Okay, now it's kind of low,
Yeah,
the
let me see
volume.
if I can get it out of the good microphone. Yeah, tell me which mic am I hitting?
Well, it was the first one initially, but now I can't even hear that.
Either. Okay. Interesting. Test, test, test.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I think I got it. Okay, George Keene is not one of my volunteers. Share screen. Audio. Share sound, share screen, share. Cool. I will have that going. Let me get started. We're doing a camping trip, Star Talk in Death Valley, November 6th.
Okay, nice.
I'm excited to announce. I've been so frustrated that so many of our programs in atheist and humanist spaces are just so intellectual. And it's really good, and we need those, but we also just need some awesome experiences.
Yeah.
The way people talk about grace and awe in so many religious spaces, I've been thinking more and more about. So finally, we decided we're going to do some big camping trip somewhere and decided Death Valley, Star Party. Originally, we were going to get an astronomer. We wound up finding the local teacher I was talking to in Sacramento, who's been going to Star Talks for like 15 years, and she took the best of all of them. Yeah,
that's pretty cool.
I want to do more stuff like this. And I took this job to run Atheists United in 2019, and we've had this constant struggle of trying to separate the difference between atheism and atheists. And like people, especially because of new atheism, I think people got so hooked on theism versus atheism, and they like couldn't see the values and experiences that just come from being an atheist that don't have to always be attached to the struggle with religion, struggle with theism. So, I mean, this is why your talk, and we've had so many speakers kind of speak to the history and activism of today this year to kind of whip people into this idea that we can organize more around values than identity these days in places like Los Angeles. But it's been a struggle. I feel like people got so branded in the Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris idea of what atheism is or isn't. And
yeah, for sure. I mean, that's how a lot of us became atheists.
Sure.
So it's hard to kind of move beyond that.
Yeah, but it becomes almost libertarianized. Like, I got mine, I don't need to help you get yours, unless it's the fight against theism.
Yeah.
So we like can't do some community programming, and we can't understand the intersectional nature of our lives. It's always been like just really frustrating. I've got a lot of like old timers that fund the organization, and then I've got a bunch of these younger people coming up, and we're trying to speak to them, and they're like, you can't talk to young people without talking about student loan debt and climate change and Black Lives Matter. And you talk to a 70-year-old who joined Atheists United in the 1980s, and they're like, that's not atheist. And I'm like really excited for your talk and others to kind of help put in perspective for people. Like, this has always been part of our tradition.
For sure.
Been involved in things like the civil rights movement, and
especially for Black atheism, because I mean they didn't have a choice, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's such a, I think, whitewashing of our movement. Like I really like. Can't believe it took so long for me to get introduced to this idea, but like we have a mostly European humanism here, right? Like we have such a westernized white humanism. Yeah. Okay, Fran's one of our board members. Yeah, I might start letting these people in. Our Zoom meetings, we've been struggling to get the attendance we normally would, but we've had a few more RSVPs for yours compared to past events. We throw this on our YouTube after the fact, so I'm gonna let these people in, and let me change the settings real quick. Security, chat, not rename themselves, and they cannot unmute themselves. Okay. Hey, Klaus.
Oh,
Klaus is one of our helpers. Will be a co-host for this meeting. All right, I'm letting people in right now, Klaus.
Okay.
And then remember, we got Zoom bombed last time, so we're after 5 to 10 minutes into the presentation, we're just not going to let anyone in again. unless we saw that they were already in and they left. Cool. All right, I'm gonna set up the live stream. Hey everyone, welcome. We're gonna get started a few minutes after the hour. We're setting up the live stream right now, so hang tight. Just to confirm, I'm sharing my screen correctly. Good. Hey everyone, we're going to get started a few minutes after the hour. Please hang tight, invite your friends, share the live stream.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Atheists United live meeting. Can you all hear me all right? Wonderful. We're about to get started here. My name is Evan Clark. I'm the executive director of Atheists United in Los Angeles, California. We've been hosting this speaker series since 1982, and we have an incredible presentation for you today. But before we get started, I have some quick announcements. So first, I want to tell you about an event we've been working on since 2019. We were going to do in the March of 2020, had to cancel, and we're finally reorganizing for November of 2021. We're planning a camping trip and Star Talk night in Death Valley National Park. So I'd like for all of you to please mark your calendars. Go ahead and check out our website. We just put it on our website last night. We are finally organizing this event, and this should be absolutely thrilling. We have a great Star Talk speaker lined up. We'll be meeting in the Mesquite Flats sand dunes, which are these gorgeous sand dunes. And the moon will set by, I believe, 6 o'clock that night, and we will have a perfect view of the stars in one of the best international dark sky locations on the planet. So we hope you can join us. Please check that out. More details on our website. And then another quick announcement, our volunteer projects continue to thrive. As many of you know, we doubled the amount of volunteer work we did during the pandemic. We decided we had an opportunity to give back more rather than less during these tough times. And our food distribution program continues to grow. We had 12 volunteers and handed out almost 2,000 pounds of food Friday, 2 days ago, at our offices, and we hope you can join our future events. We have flyering 2 weeks from now in order to promote that event, and then we need as many volunteers as possible. A lot of work, but it is very fulfilling work. We usually feed about 100 families, meal kits locally. We get a grant from Foundation Beyond Belief to pull off this program, and I just want to thank you all for being members and supporters, and especially those that come out and volunteer with us. We also have been launching a few other service projects that we haven't been able to do for the past few months, including volunteering with tree people. Our highway cleanups are back up and going again. So please check out our website, check out some of our volunteer programs, and join us. And then we have an announcement today. After our meeting, hang around if you'd like to learn more about this. One of our board members will be explaining the details of this, but our board of directors are democratically elected each year. And it's that time of year where we do a call for nominations before we start our formal election. Since we're not doing in-person meetings, this is an online process, but we are asking for nominations now. If you are an active member of the organization and would like to run for a board seat, we have openings for the position of president, secretary, and 3 director at large seats. Again, we have a board member that will make an announcement after this meeting with more details and answer any questions you have. So just hang out after the meeting. And then if you can hang out through the nominations discussion at the end of this meeting, please hang out with Klaus, our godfather of fun. He likes to host our hereafter party and just gives a social space for everyone to chat after the meeting. Wonderful. Okay, with that, we're going to get started. I'm going to announce our speaker here. We're going to give him the floor for our presentation, and then after that, we'll do Q&A. Please put your questions in the chat, and I'll read as many as I can, and we'll go from there. You will be muted through this whole meeting to avoid Zoom bombing and for security reasons, but if you can hang out all the way to the end, we will create some space for you to unmute and ask some direct questions. All right, with that, let's get started. Our speaker today, I am thrilled to host. I've been wanting to have this speaker for a long time, so please help me in welcoming Christoper Cameron. Christoper is a professor of history and chair of the Africana Studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He received his BA in history from Keene State College and his MA and Ph.D. in American history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research and teaching interests include early American history, history of slavery and abolition, and African American religious and intellectual history. Cameron is the author of To Plead Our Own Case, African Americans in Massachusetts, and The Making of Antislavery Movement and Black Freethinkers, History of African American Secularism. He's the co-editor of New Perspectives on the Black Intellectual Tradition. His research has been supported by the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, the Massachusetts Historical Society, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Council of Learned Societies. Please help me in welcoming Chris Cameron for his presentation on Black freethinkers and the civil rights movement. Freethought and the civil rights movement. Thank you. All right.
Thank you for that introduction, Evan, and for the invitation to speak to this group. And thank you all for being here today. I'm really looking forward to sharing some of my research with you and engaging in Q&A afterwards. I'll start out by talking about the broader book project, just to sort of put today's talk into a little bit of context. So this particular talk draws from the final chapter of my book, Black Freethinkers, A History of African American Secularism. That chapter explores the civil rights and Black power eras. And it's probably, or it is the most substantial chapter in the book. That was the one that manuscript could have been 100 pages easily. So I had to cut it down to 65. So that's the fourth chapter. I'll talk first about how I got into the project, then give you a very brief synopsis of the 3 chapters leading up to my discussion of the civil rights era. And I'm happy to sort of get into more discussion of some of that earlier history in the Q&A. So this research kind of grew out of the work that I was doing for my first book, which explored African-American abolitionists in Massachusetts, and particularly the intersections of Puritan theology and Black abolitionism. I was really interested in how Black activists in the Revolutionary era in Massachusetts sort of employed the language of Puritan theology in their critiques of the institution of slavery. So in doing some of that work, I had to read very broadly in African-American religious history and enslaved religion. And there was one book in particular that I was reading that really became sort of a spark for this research. I was reading Al Rabbito's classic book, Slave Religion, published back in 1979, but when I was working on my book in 2010, 2011, still very relevant for any discussion of religion among enslaved people. And for most of the book, Rabbito is discussing sort of the rise of a syncretic blend of African traditions and evangelical Protestantism among slaves. It looks into Catholics a little bit as well, but it really is talking about a sort of creative blend of African traditions and Christianity, whether Catholic or Protestant. But there's a few pages towards the end of the book where he sort of diverges a little bit, and he says, you know, of course, not all slaves believed in these ideas. Some couldn't reconcile notions of a just and loving God with their condition as enslaved people. And he doesn't dwell on this too much. There's only about 2 pages, but he gives a couple of examples. And I was really intrigued by that. So I started looking for evidence of Black freethought in any guise, whether atheism, agnosticism, deism, even just general religious skepticism. Started looking for evidence of that in all the slave narratives that I could get my hands on, many of which I was able to access pretty easily through Documenting the American South, which is hosted by UNC Chapel Hill's Center for the Study of the American South. And what I found was that there was quite a bit of evidence for the development of atheism among enslaved people during the early to mid 19th century. And so that sort of sparked even more research into this history and sort of had me moving into the 20th century. And I suspected that, you know, atheism, agnosticism, various forms of free thought, paganism would be more prevalent among artists, intellectuals, writers, right? People with people with some education, probably people in more urban areas. So I started reading, everything by famous, well-known Black writers I could. And within just a few months, I knew that I had the seeds of a book from the research that I'd already done. I could tell that this history was substantial enough for a book, and that nobody else had really written on this from a historical perspective. We have great studies of Black humanism, of course, from Anthony Pinn, who's been working on this for a couple of decades now. His work is more kind of theological in nature, right? And a lot of it goes towards kind of constructing a contemporary Black humanist theology. But as far as historians, nobody else was really working on this. So I was really excited to kind of dig into it. And that initial research that I did in slave narratives provided the basis for chapter 1 of the book, which explores largely the 19th century and looks at the rise of atheism among slave communities in the South. And so here's where we see a sort of divergence in the origins of the Freethought movement, which was sort of more common in the North, right, during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and really stemmed among white freethinkers from Enlightenment philosophy. Some took a little sort of a way station between, from Unitarianism, then on to Freethought. But really is liberal religion and Enlightenment philosophy for white freethinkers that sort of led them to their critiques of religion and their various skeptical positions. For Black freethinkers, I found it was very different. Their religious skepticism grew more out of their lived experience as enslaved people. It grew more from their experience with sort of hypocritical Christian masters who would make them go to church on Sunday and then treat them like trash the rest of the week. It grew from the rise of pro-slavery Christianity during the 1840s and the 1850s, whereby ministers all throughout the South and theologians and intellectuals employed the Bible to justify the institution of slavery, when enslaved people themselves, reading the Bible, felt that this was more of an anti-slavery document when we consider the spirit of it. So pro-slavery Christianity and hypocritical professions of Christianity, as well as just enslaved people's own reflections on their experiences in the world, caused many to turn to atheism, right? And this is expressed in a number of slave narratives. It's expressed in travel narratives of people coming down south and sort of commenting on the religious positions of enslaved people. Now, from there, I turn to the 20th century, and the next 2 chapters of the book really explore basically the same time period from about 1900 to 1935, 1940. Chapter 2 looks at the Harlem Renaissance, or the New Negro Renaissance, as scholars are calling it now, because scholars have recognized it was much broader than Harlem. There was sort of an artistic and literary renaissance in Chicago and Detroit and in New Orleans, right, and even other places in the Atlantic world, if we consider like the Negritude movement in the Caribbean and in France. So I looked there at the writings of individuals like Nella Larson, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Elaine Locke, Claude McKay, many of the sort of well-known Black intellectuals and writers of the Harlem Renaissance, people that I had to read in junior high school and in high school, right? Everybody has to read Their Eyes Were Watching God, but your teacher doesn't tell you that Zora Neale Hurston was an agnostic and a deist, right? Which is clearly expressed in her 1943 autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road. So that chapter really explores the growth of free thought among Black writers from the 19-teens up through the end of the Renaissance period, roughly 1940 or so. Chapter 3 looks at roughly the same period, but instead of focusing on literature and art, I'm really looking at the rise of radical politics among African Americans and Blacks' embrace of socialism and communism from the 19 teens until roughly about the same period as chapter 2, the 1940s. And here I found that leading radical political activists like Hubert Harrison, Louise Thompson Patterson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Richard Wright. He's a figure that sort of straddles both chapters, the Renaissance and socialism and communism. Many of these leading Black radical intellectuals and political activists were also freethinkers, right? Some were attracted to the socialists and communists because they were already freethinkers. Some were attracted more for political and economic reasons, but then these parties were very hostile to religion and to people who practiced traditional religion. So some would sort of become more skeptical after joining these parties. So religious and political radicalism sort of reinforced each other among this group of activists and intellectuals in the interwar era. So that really provides the backdrop for my discussion of Black free thought and the civil rights movement. Now that fourth chapter really looks primarily at the 1950s and 1960s, although we shouldn't really draw a kind of sharp dichotomy between earlier struggles for justice and equality and later ones, right? A lot of scholars have argued for this conception of a long civil rights movement that really spans the 1920s through the 1970s, right? And the fact that a lot of the activism, a lot of the ideas of leading figures in the 1950s and 60s drew from that of their predecessors working as far back as the 1920s. And this is true for freethinkers as well, right? Stokely Carmichael would be a case in point. During the mid-1950s, Stokely Carmichael, future civil rights leader, began traveling with his father from their Italian neighborhood in the Bronx down to 145th Street in Harlem to get his hair cut by a Black barber. And this would be an experience that really initiated Stokely Carmichael's political education. He recalls there came into the shop old Garveyites, racemen, street players, Black Republicans and Black Muslims, nationalists of all descriptions, and the rappers, poets, and wordmen. While there's never really a lot of political discussion at his junior high school in the Bronx during those years, the men at the barbershop discussed all of these issues at length. Then later on, while he was enrolled in the Bronx High School of Science, Carmichael went to Harlem to visit his cousin Inez, and he encountered Richard B. Moore, among other Harlem street speakers. Moore was an atheist, communist, and one of the founders of the African Blood Brotherhood in the 1920s, and I discuss him in my chapter on socialism and communism. Moore and other speakers in Harlem, including Queen Mother Audley Moore, staunch advocate of reparations, as well as Malcolm X, became important influences on Stokely Carmichael, who would become a freethinker and a committed Pan-Africanist over the next decade. Carmichael noted that Harlem's stepladder orators, like Richard B. Moore, were our secular prophets. They were keepers of the flame, holding aloft our heritage as African people in exile, ceaselessly exhorting us to keep historical and revolutionary faith with our ancestors' long history of struggle and resistance. Now, Richard B. Moore's influence on Stokely Carmichael demonstrates important continuities between Freethought from the interwar period to the civil rights era. Activists such as Moore, Louise Thompson Patterson, W.E.B. Du Bois, and others would mentor a new generation of radical political thinkers and religious skeptics. While this new generation did not always subscribe to the communist beliefs of their predecessors, many did adopt their combination of religious skepticism and radical politics. But Black free thought would also undergo significant changes during the 1960s and 1970s. For one, open discussion of religious skepticism became less taboo. While earlier Black freethinkers sometimes waited decades to reveal their doubts about Christianity, those in the civil rights era were often open about their atheism and agnosticism during that same period or very shortly after. With increased access to education, the sheer numbers of Black freethinkers also began to rise. Black secularists could be found in nearly every major political group and cultural movement, from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to the Black Arts Movement to the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And many of the most prominent Black political and cultural figures from this era were freethinkers, including Carmichael, James Forman, James Baldwin, Huey Newton, and Lorraine Hansberry. They often denounced Christianity in harsher terms than their predecessors had done, and they continued to chip away at the ties between religion, racism, and patriarchy in the United States. Their work both drew from that of their predecessors and would inspire a new generation of freethinkers who in the 1980s would help to institutionalize the movement and create organizations specifically dedicated to advancing the cause of free thought. So now I'll briefly get into the origins of the civil rights movement, and then talk about the sort of main organization that we see sort of influencing the rise of secularism among Black activists. And that would be SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So the civil rights and Black power movements of the 1950s and 1960s, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, had their roots and development stretching back to the early 20th century. The one organization that's come to be most associated with civil rights is the NAACP, which was organized in 1910, but really didn't start to make serious inroads into the system of Jim Crow until the 1920s. And it did so at that point by helping Black activists develop organizational and leadership capabilities and slowly chipping away at the myth that Black people were content with second-class citizenship and segregation. Now, while there were some cracks in segregation during the 1930s, due in part to agitation from labor unions, other minorities, and liberals fighting New Deal opponents of the practice, the condition of most Black people in the country changed little during that decade. But in the 1940s, with the onset of World War II, you would see a new sense of militancy among African Americans. So membership in the NAACP increased tenfold during World War II. And the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, was founded to employ nonviolent direct action in order to challenge Jim Crow. At the beginning of the decade, in 1941, the Black agnostic A. Philip Randolph organized the March on Washington Committee that threatened a massive march on the Capitol. And in response, Franklin Roosevelt would issue an executive order that set up the President's Committee on Fair Employment Practices and would outlaw racially discriminatory practices in hiring by labor unions and companies with government contracts. We would also see during the 1940s that a sort of decline in the respectability of racism, right? Largely in result to the rise of Nazism and the decline of imperialism during this period. Also, works like Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma helped to attack the foundations of racism. And finally, independence movements in Africa, immediately following the war, showed African Americans that change was possible and that global white supremacy, including its local variant, was vulnerable. Now, in addition to CORE and the NAACP, the SCLC, or Southern Christian Leadership Conference, would also emerge during the 1950s after the Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama in 1954. So those would be sort of three of the key civil rights organizations, right? And then in 1960, you would see the creation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which would emerge as a top civil rights organization during the 1960s. Now, SNCC grew out of the sit-in movement close to where I am in Greensboro, North Carolina in February 1960. The sit-ins would increase rapidly, expanding across the state and the Eastern Seaboard. And by mid-April 1960, an estimated 50,000 people had participated in the sit-ins, with the vast majority of them being students. Now, in contrast to Black churches in the South, only about 10% of which actively participated in civil rights organizing. More than 90% of students at Greensboro area colleges supported sit-ins, and this level of enthusiasm was replicated across many campuses, right? So the main ideologies of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was largely religious, right? A sort of prophetic brand of Christianity, kind of an outgrowth of the social gospel of the early 20th century. SNCC's early character as a sort of religious organization was driven by one of its most influential leaders, James Lawson. Lawson was a Northerner who had been attending the Vanderbilt School of Theology before he was expelled for taking part in the Nashville sit-ins. And of all the participants at the sort of organizing conference for SNCC in early 1960, Lawson was probably most familiar with the philosophy of nonviolent direct action. He had been imprisoned for refusing to fight in the Korean War in the 1950s, and upon his release had traveled to India to do missionary work there for a few years. And while there, he studied Gandhian nonviolence and then would hold workshops for activists in Nashville, right? So Lawson and the sort of general religious nature of SNCC can be summed up with one quote of his. He says that we affirm the philosophical or religious ideal of nonviolence as the foundation of our purpose, the presupposition of our faith, and the manner of our action. Nonviolence, as it grows out of the Judaic-Christian tradition, seeks a social order of justice permeated by love. So for Lawson, bringing about change required or would be vastly helped by belief in Christianity. And that in turn sort of influenced their belief in nonviolent direct action as the primary sort of political means or method of the organization. So SNCC was initially dedicated to Christian principles and to nonviolence, but tensions existed early on between religious and secular activists. Even after the 1960 conference held in Raleigh, many people began to move away from Lawson and John Lewis, the president of SNCC, from their sort of religious radicalism. In 1961, tensions would rise even higher as the members debated whether to focus on nonviolent direct action or engage in activities such as voter registration drives. Those who advocated the former opposed any move that would take the focus off desegregation. And many believe that new calls for voter registration were a tool of the Kennedy administration to sort of redirect SNCC's militancy towards other goals. But really within about a year and a half of the creation of SNCC, the transition towards a more secular approach to politics had gotten underway. And early on, it was largely due to the influence of Bob Moses, who just passed away a couple of weeks ago. Moses had attended Hamilton College in New York, where he encountered the work of French existentialist philosopher Albert Camus, whose humanism and individualism he found appealing. Moses began working for SNCC in the summer of 1960. And the following year, he opened a voter registration school in Macomb, Mississippi. By the time he did so, many of the original students who founded the organization were no longer involved, and SNCC was being run by staff members. The sort of staff members saw their methods of achieving social change as differing dramatically from those of other reform organizations. They retained some of their liberal and Christian beliefs, but they had broken away from conventional liberalism and institutional religion by inserting an unwillingness to compromise their ideals. And the break from institutional religion of SNCC would become most pronounced in the life and career of James Forman. Forman was involved in SNCC from its inception, and he played a key role in its growth as a national civil rights organization, eventually becoming its executive secretary. Forman's political ideology was not grounded in Christian theology, as James Lawson's or John Lewis's was, but rather in secular humanism. And he had begun to move away from religion as a young man. He actually had attended Catholic school in 1935. He was up for a prize for being the smartest kid in class the following year. He was tied with one other boy, and he ended up losing because the other child was taking classes to become a Catholic, and he wasn't. And this would be sort of one kind of early injustice that would begin to spark his opposition towards religion. In class, a nun named Sister Cleavage also used him as an example of one who would go to purgatory and not heaven because he was not Catholic. Something he would write in his autobiography, The Making of Black Revolutionary, that caused him great emotional turmoil. He soon transferred to public school, but his problems with religion didn't end there. So during the summers, he would actually go and stay with his grandmother in Mississippi, where he had to attend her church, the Concord Baptist Church. And when he was 12, he attended a revival there. He was seated up front on the mourner's bench, also called the anxious bench. This is basically the place where the minister places all of the sort of unconverted people in the church, and everybody in the church sort of prays over them. And, you know, I guess the deal is one by one, they start getting picked off by God and being saved, right? So they come off of the bench. But basically you stay off there, you stay on the bench until you say you're saved. So he's there. Some of his friends had yelled out that they had gotten religion. They were able to leave. The older people shouted that they had got religion too, Forman recalled. And he says, at the age of 12, in a Baptist tradition setting, I did not have the courage to tell my grandmother that I thought this was all nonsense. I simply observed what had been happening around me, and I knew that I too could fabricate some tears in this emotionally charged atmosphere. So I covered my face with my handkerchief and cried, Lord, have mercy. It worked. I was taken off the mourner's bench, and the people talked of how many children got saved that day by the grace of the Lord. So his development towards atheism and secular humanism would continue in college. In 1947, Forman was at Wilson Junior College in Chicago, and he started to develop more serious questions about God, right? Questions like, how could he exist? What type of God was he that would allow all the injustices in the world, world wars, killing, prejudices, right? He would end up dropping out, going to serve a stint in the army, and then later on re-enrolling at Roosevelt College in Chicago. And this would basically complete his journey towards atheism and secular humanism. He was enrolled in a philosophy course there, and he noted, "God finally died in my conscious mind. For the final examination, we had to write an essay discussing the most important thing we had learned from the course. This is the essence of what I wrote. The most important things that I've learned from this class are a number of intellectual arguments which disprove the myth that there is a God." Now, Foreman's ideas, his sort of tying together his atheism and his political thought and activity is really kind of emblematic of a lot of Black freethinkers of the civil rights era, right? For him, atheism was an essential component of his politics, right? Just like for, a lot of other Black leaders, scholars will look and discuss how their belief in Christianity or a particular brand of Christianity has influenced their politics. One of the things I try to do in this book is really show how belief in atheism, how individuals' humanism also influences their politics. So it's not just a disbelief in God or, for agnostics, a lack of belief in a God, but it's also an orientation that dramatically shapes how they sort of move in the world, right? So James Foreman thought that belief in God was a major factor keeping Blacks in a subordinate position in the United States. He argued that when a people who are poor, suffering with disease and sickness, accept the fact that God has ordained for them to be this way, then they will never do anything about their human condition. In other words, a belief in a supreme being or God weakens the will of a people to change conditions themselves. He says, as a Negro who has grown up in the United States, I believe that the belief in God has hurt my people. We have put off doing something about our condition on this earth because we have believed that God was going to take care of business in heaven. Now, Foreman is also a really important figure because he was sort of at the intersection of what we think of as the kind of traditional wing of the civil rights movement, right, which is the belief in kind of nonviolent direct action, and then also that sort of transition into the Black Power era after 1966. So Foreman had been involved with SNCC, a sort of very traditional, at least early on, civil rights organization. He became the leader of it. But then in 1966, he would become one of the earliest supporters of Black Power as an ideology and as a movement in the United States. So SNCC had started out promoting nonviolence and racial integration, but it would move away from these positions around 1966 when the call for Black Power swept the nation, right? So what is involved with this transition? What exactly did it look like? Well, for Foreman, for individuals like Robert Williams, Malcolm X, who was an inspiration of the Black Power movement, one of the key things was it offered a strong rejection of the idea of nonviolent direct action or nonviolence in general, right? So for advocates of Black Power, nonviolence would actually only perpetuate violence against African Americans, right? They argue that in order for the Black man, and they usually did use this very gendered language, in order for the Black man to be respected in the United States, he had to show his willingness to fight back, right? He had to show his willingness to employ violence for his own self-defense. That was one of the earliest sort of articulations of Black Power, but it also included a number of other components, right? It included a desire for self-determination on sort of many different fronts. So African Americans controlling their political destinies. This would mean sort of, getting Blacks registered to vote, and especially in places where African Americans represented a majority of the population, cities like Newark, New Jersey, Detroit, Philadelphia, it meant electing Black political leaders who would look out for the interests of the Black community. There was also a sort of economic self-determination component to Black power as well, right? Where, they wanted to keep Black money within Black communities. So building up Black businesses. So this is where Black power sort of drew from earlier iterations of Black nationalist philosophy. So Foreman is at the sort of forefront of promoting this transition to Black power, and then this movement would become institutionalized in the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, which also emerged sort of later in 1966 in Oakland, California, right? So this really emerged as a sort of result of continued police violence and police brutality against African Americans in the Bay Area. The Black Panther Party would be formed by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. And it's an organization that would contribute significantly to Black Freethought during this era, because in addition to rejecting the philosophy of nonviolence, that was prevalent within the NAACP or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, many leading figures in the Black Panther Party would also reject the sort of theology and religion of some of those mainstream civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., right? So Huey Newton is a case in point, one of the two founders of the Black Panther Party, helped to develop the 10-point platform that articulated the main goals, right? Self-determination for Black communities, full employment, healthcare, decent education, right? And Newton was one of several Black Panther Party leaders who embraced Freethought, right? He didn't have a particularly contentious or unpleasant relationship with religion as a youth like James Foreman did. In fact, his father was a pastor of Bethel Baptist Church in Monroe, Louisiana. And for most of his childhood, Newton actually thought that he would be a preacher just like his father. But his religious beliefs, kind of like James Foreman's, started to shift after he took philosophy courses at Oakland City College, later Merritt College, in 1959. So after reading existentialist thinkers such as Camus, Sartre, and Soren Kierkegaard, Newton realized that he had been sort of moving towards existentialist belief for some time. And he also began to question his religious upbringing and belief in God, right? So he writes in his autobiography, Revolutionary Suicide, in trying to find God and understand him as a philosophical existential being, I began to question not only the Christian definition of God, but also the very foundation of my religion. I saw that it was based on belief alone, the soundness of which was never questioned. Right. So like many sort of leading Black intellectuals, right, and other freethinkers, it was his exposure to higher education and philosophy in particular that helped Newton move away from the religious upbringing of his childhood. But it was also just sort of a reflection on his society, right? It was a reflection on the Black freedom struggle and the advances it had made and the advances it hadn't made, right? People like Huey Newton, David Hilliard, right? And other leaders, Eldridge Cleaver in the Black Panther Party, they observed the so-called gains of the civil rights movement. And for them, things like integration in schools and being able to eat at a restaurant, it wasn't enough, right? If you could still walk down the street and get beat or shot by a racist police officer, then the civil rights movement just wasn't working for them, right? So their belief kind of grew out of their education, but it also grew, like for enslaved people 100 years before, it grew out of their sort of lived reality and their observations of the sort of efficacy of religion in politics and of religion in the Black freedom struggle. And the Black Panther Party would become very significant to the Black Freethought movement for a number of reasons. One, as I just mentioned, leading figures in the party were secularists themselves and helped to sort of spread this among their membership. They did so through reading circles, right, and educational outreach programs where, in order to become a member of the Black Panther Party, you had to read revolutionary political thinkers, right? You had to read Marx, you had to read Mao and others during that time period. So that was one way. But they also helped to spread free thought through their 10-point platform, right, which didn't include anything related to religion. It was basically sort of a humanist platform for advancing the cause of Black people, and through their newspaper, the Black Panther, right, which featured essays that denounced religion, featured poems by Black freethinkers such as Sarah Webster Fabio and Yvette Pearson that criticized religion and argued for a sort of new humanism for Black people. So while the Black Panther Party was not an explicitly secular organization, it is an organization that helped to advance secular politics and secularism in general during this time period. Now I'll talk about one more element of Black power and then I'll finish up. So the sort of main institutional expression of Black power, like I mentioned, was the Black Panther Party. But the sort of artistic and literary expression of Black power would be the Black arts movement. And just like the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and the 1930s, the Black arts movement would likewise help to sort of advance Black secularism in the United States. So most scholars date the Black arts movement from roughly 1965 to 1976. It has similar themes as the Harlem Renaissance, right? An articulation of Black cultural nationalism, the idea that Black is beautiful, a rejection of Western standards. Also helped to articulate an appreciation of African culture, right? And the literary use of Black music. But the Black arts movement also had some important differences, including the prevalence of anti-white language, right? And a greater appreciation for the Black vernacular. And finally, artists of the Black arts movement often renounced respectability politics, right? This notion that African Americans need to show themselves moral and all of that in order to be deserving of citizenship. You see much more of a rejection of that respectability politics than you saw among earlier writers. But a common thread in both movements was the importance of a secular perspective among many of its key participants. So writers such as Lorraine Hansberry, James Baldwin, and Nikki Giovanni used their plays, poems, essays, and novels to critique Christianity and to explore the possibilities of Black life without religion. And I'll just talk about one of these writers in particular. Lorraine Hansberry sort of started to kind of move away from religion a little bit during the 1950s. Hansberry had grown up in Chicago. She was born there in 1930 to Carl and Nantil Hansberry. Her father was actually fairly wealthy, founded one of Chicago's first Black banks and a real estate company, and was politically active in the NAACP, actually successfully challenged racially exclusionary housing covenants in a Supreme Court case, 1943. And Hansberry would begin to sort of develop her own political ideology while working with another prominent Black freethinker, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Paul Robeson on their newspaper Freedom. This was an anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist publication that Hansberry began working for in 1951. And this situation is part of that kind of intergenerational influence that I was talking about, where you see Black freethinkers from, the 1920s. Of course, Du Bois lived to almost 100 years old, so he would span multiple generations. But you see folks who, first wrote against religion in the 19-teens or 1920s, and some of them are still influencing activist artists and writers in the 1950s and 1960s. So Hansberry would begin to develop her sort of anti-imperialist politics as well as her secular perspective while working for that paper Freedom, in particular, her secularism, when she was writing a review of Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, right? And there she starts to sort of tie patriarchy to the prevalence of Christianity, right? Kind of like earlier Black Freethought writers like Nella Larson and Zora Neale Hurston had done in the 1920s and 1930s. And Hansberry would sort of develop her perspective on religion in her most well-known play, A Raisin in the Sun, right, which debuted in 1959, was an instant success. The play is set in the South Side of Chicago, sometime between the end of World War II in 1959. And it focuses on the Younger family, shortly after the death of the patriarch, Walter Younger Sr. The family is waiting on $10,000 in life insurance money. Much of the drama revolves around what will be done with the funds. Walter Younger would like Mama to give him the money to invest in a liquor store, while the mother wants to use the money to buy a house in a white neighborhood and support the medical career of her daughter, Benitha. Benitha is a modern woman who embraces feminism, anti-colonialism, and atheism. While many people urge her to marry her middle-class suitor, George Murchison, she decides to wait until her schooling is complete, putting her career ahead of middle-class domesticity. And when Mama remarks to Benitha that she'll be a doctor if God wills it, Benitha replies, God hasn't got a thing to do with it. She goes on to express her frustration that God gets all the credit for human achievements, asking whether or not God would be paying her tuition. Now, Mama's incredulous at the statement, noting that she took her and Walter to church every Sunday and that Benitha had not been brought up to speak so disrespectfully about God. Benitha says, Mama, you don't understand. It's all a matter of ideas, and God is just one idea I don't accept. It's not important. I'm not going out and being immoral or committing crimes because I don't believe in God. It's just that I get tired of him getting all the credit for things the human race achieves through its own efforts. Now, one thing I've had to do with a lot of the fictional works that I've discussed in the book is really, make sure that they're actually reflective of the ideas of the author, right? And that the author isn't just sort of playing around and exploring ideas, but they're really like heavily religious themselves. So I was always sort of cross-checking my sources with novelists and poets, just to make sure that they're actually reflective of their own beliefs. And I found an interview that Lorraine Hansberry gave shortly after Raisin came out in 1959, where she says, Benitha is basically me 8 years ago, is where I was 8 years ago, and is really reflective of my views on religion, right? So we see Hansberry's her own free thought, her own secularism expressed through this play. We see the same thing with James Baldwin in his play Blues for Mr. Charlie, a play that's widely regarded as having sort of kicked off the Black arts movement. And we also see secular perspectives throughout the poetry and writings of Nikki Giovanni, and even nonfiction writings from Baldwin, especially his work, The Fire Next Time, right? So the Black arts movement would become just another method of spreading Black free thought, of sort of popularizing it, and of influencing later Black writers, right? Like people like Octavia Butler, a famous Black science fiction writer, would sort of read some of the works of Baldwin and some of these other secular thinkers. And so we see a tie between the civil rights era and those writers emerging later in the 1970s and 1980s. So with the prominence of secularism among writers, artists, and intellectuals in the Black arts movement, among leaders in the Black Panther Party, and even among activists in some of your traditional civil rights organizations, we really have to sort of reassess our thoughts on the intersection of religion and the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement is often seen as a religious movement, and you know, with the arguments that it just would not have been possible without the Black church. Now, not to discount the influence of churches or religious leaders in civil rights, but Barbara Savage notes, historian Barbara Savage notes in her work, Your Spirits Walk Beside Us, that very few Black churches in the South actually participated in open civil rights organizing, right? She says the idea that the civil rights movement is a religious movement is a miracle in and of itself, right? We can see that secularists, secular activists, artists, writers, and intellectuals were very prominent in the leading literary and intellectual movements of the day, as well as very prominent in the leading Black activist movement for the Black Power movement, the Black Panther Party. So they played a key role in both the civil rights and Black Power movements. And I think it's really important to sort of recognize that history, because it's one that was not only significant in its own time, but has continued to influence activists, writers, and intellectuals of all stripes moving past that period. Thank you very much.
Beautiful, thank you. That was a lot of information. We will do our best to get some questions in. Let's just start with where people can get your books.
Sure. All of my books are on Amazon. The first one, To Plead Our Own Cause, Black Freethinkers. And I actually just had a book released last week. It's called Race, Religion, and Black Lives Matter. I think there's a couple of chapters that would be interesting to this group. That's an edited collection, so I brought together 10 other scholars to write on various aspects of religion and Black Lives Matter. One writer has a chapter on humanism and Black Lives Matter as expressed through Black music, people like Kendrick Lamar and Beyonce. And I have a chapter in the book on the Black Unitarian Universalist Caucus, right? Which was in one of many Black caucuses that emerged in American churches during the 1960s, and was really trying to sort of blend the politics of Black power with the theology of Unitarian Universalism. And you know, many Black UUs were also secularist. Not all of them, but many were. So yeah, that's on Amazon as well.
Wonderful. You just got someone in the comments saying they're heading to the bookstore today to get it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know you swung back to this at the end of your presentation, but I couldn't help but really catch the notes you were saying about 90% of college students versus 10% of churches. And if you can expound a little bit on how we know this and what it looked like. I don't think that's common knowledge for most people.
Yeah. So, I mean, we know it just by looking at one way we know it is through disciplinary hearings at colleges, right? So, so many colleges, even HBCUs, right, like North Carolina A&T, which is where the four students who led the initial sit-in were at. Many of the college leaders were sort of opposed to their activities, right? And a lot of them could be and were exposed to disciplinary infractions, violations of, the student code of conduct and all of that for some of their activity. So, scholars of the civil rights movement have kind of explored a lot of these college records and used those to come up with the stats about participation. The numbers on churches mainly comes from a survey that Barbara Savage did in that book, Your Spirits Walk Beside Us, The Politics of Black Religion, where she sort of painstakingly went through and looked at all of the Black churches in the South that were openly advocating civil rights or participating in the movement. Now, this isn't to say those churches were opposed to civil rights and were trying to reinforce white supremacy, but many of them were probably scared for their livelihoods, right? And their very lives, right? So yeah, that's how we know, mainly looking at disciplinary records and Barbara Savage's work.
Wonderful. And speaking to the religious diversity of these different movements, I know the Christian movement is what the main narrative usually is, but people know at least about the Nation of Islam and some other Muslim groups involved. You're now writing about, and there are more scholars talking about, the secular and free thought takes. How much research is there out there, or was there a lot of other minority religious interaction with these movements or those understudied? Yeah, what were you finding when you were doing your research?
Yeah, I mean, I was mainly just focusing on the Freethinkers because so many people have explored kind of traditional religion in the civil rights movement. But one interesting thing I found in the course of my research is the influence of members of the Nation of Islam on Black Freethinkers, right? So somebody like Eldridge Cleaver, for example, who spent a number of years in prison, and it wasn't uncommon for Black prisoners to be exposed to the Nation of Islam. So Cleaver, while he was in prison, he would read speeches of Malcolm X and all of that. And politically, he agreed with the Nation of Islam. He agreed with their emphasis on Black nationalism, on self-determination, right? Their rejection of the philosophy of nonviolence. But at the same time, he was reading people like Thomas Paine and Voltaire and other like very, very early freethinkers in American and European history. So he couldn't really get with the theology of the nation, but he loved their politics. And this was a case with many other leading Black freethinkers of the 1960s, right? They, Huey Newton, Stokely Carmichael, all these people, they loved Malcolm X. They loved what he sort of represented. They loved his sort of brashness and outspokenness, as well as just his general political philosophy. But they couldn't get with Islam as a religion, or the NOI's particular brand of Islam. So that's one really interesting thing, is that you see a lot of Black freethinkers embracing the sort of Black nationalist politics of the Nation of Islam at the same time as they rejected their religious perspectives.
Right. And I know A. Philip Randolph and the Black Panther Party, for instance, worked with churches a lot in their organizing. Did they always think of that as a tool? It was just another tool in their toolbox? Or what did they write about or talk about how they worked with religious institutions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So this was an essential tool in their toolbox, right? So in many communities, especially smaller communities, the church was the only place where you could sort of go and organize particular events or get a lot of people together, or where it was even safe to meet, right? Folks like A. Philip Randolph, I mean, he was an agnostic by the time he started Messenger magazine in 1918, right? But nevertheless, he would be a member of an AME church for over 50 years. But at the end of that 50 years, he would be recognized as a leading humanist, right? It was really significant and necessary for a lot of these Black freethinkers to work with churches. So this was another way where, they didn't buy into the theology of Christianity, but nevertheless try to build coalitions with religious people. So Stokely Carmichael, he's actually sort of a standout Black freethinker of the 1960s, because whereas a lot of folks like James Forman and Baldwin and Hansberry and others have no problem being very open about their religious skepticism during the 1960s, Carmichael was actually a little more reticent, and he really didn't write about it till later on when he wrote his autobiography. And in his autobiography, he says that, like, look, I became an atheist when I was at Bronx High School of Science, taking science and philosophy classes. So by 17, I was an atheist, but I wasn't going down to the South and talking all of that atheism stuff, because he says that would have sort of turned off all of the people that I was trying to organize and that I was trying to work with, right? So he sort of stands out in that way. But most of the leading Black political figures, even if they rejected Christianity, still worked with churches. And you also have this situation among like Black writers and artists where, a lot of them grew up in the church, and culturally and, intellectually, they're very influenced by Black religion, and they even really love certain elements of Black religion, the music, right? James Baldwin talks about, like, there's nothing like the drama of a Pentecostal worship service, right? And religious themes are really infused throughout all of his writing. But then you read his nonfiction works and he says, I've rejected these ideas, right? But nevertheless, there's still something about Black Christianity that he really loved. And that was the case earlier with somebody like Langston Hughes, right, who rejected religion pretty early on, but you still see Christian themes kind of showing up in his writings. So it's all to say that Black freethinkers would have a very kind of complicated relationship with religion, and would probably have a little more trouble kind of completely divorcing themselves from religious institutions than their white counterparts.
We had a question here that reads, anti-communist hysteria was very big in the 50s and 60s and so on. I'd always heard that Martin Luther King Jr. was at the forefront of the civil rights movement because of his Christian identity. It was a shield against charges of communism.
Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely true. So his Christian identity, his articulation of a social gospel is one of the things that propelled King to leadership, as well as his own background as a member of the Black middle class. His father was a pastor, right, of a prominent church in Atlanta. He would go on to be highly educated himself, go into Morehouse and then Boston University, or can't remember if it's university or college, but one of those two for his PhD. I think it was Boston College. Highly educated, right? There aren't a ton of Black people with a PhD, and he got his at like 25, 26. So when he finished his PhD, he's already the son of a minister. He's already seen at that very young age as somebody with incredible promise and potential. So that fact, along with his great rhetorical abilities, propelled him to the center of the movement. Now, this anti-communist hysteria actually does play an important role in the history of Freethought, right? In that you do see freethinkers during the 1950s either downplaying or outright denying their secularism, right? So Langston Hughes was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1956. And this, of course, is the main committee investigating charges of communism throughout the United States. Would be responsible for, the blackballing of Hollywood actors and all of that, and just various people throughout the United States. And Hughes was being questioned about the atheist and communist themes from his 1932 poem, Goodbye Christ. And Hughes actually, he basically denies that he is an atheist, right? He says, I don't believe in any of that anymore. I'm basically a good Christian. Now, faced with the possibility of jail or being blackballed within their profession or lying about your religion, I mean, the choice is pretty easy. I mean, that not a lot of people are going to sort of stand up in the face of those possibilities, right? So, I mean, I believe that Hughes was just lying, and others who came before these committees were. They were just trying to sort of save their necks. So yeah, this sort of anti-communism does play an important role, and it's one of the main reasons why W.E.B. Du Bois, a leading Black freethinker, ended up leaving the United States and spending his final years in Ghana.
We had a question from Greg that says, do you believe that our Black movement will be as efficient as those in the near past in a socio-political sense? And do you see a redesign in Black churches?
Redesign in Black churches. I mean, if Black churches want to stay relevant, then they're going to have to, right? I mean, you go into a lot of them and it's primarily older people. There, so many churches just don't have younger members. It's much harder for them to attract younger members. So yeah, I mean, I think, like all churches, that's not just Black churches, that's all churches in the United States in general are really struggling to appeal to the youth. So yeah, I do think something needs to give for Black churches, and in order for them to grow and thrive, if that's their goal, and I'm sure it is. In terms of the Black movement being as efficient as its predecessor, I'm guessing they're referring to Black Lives Matter, and I would say no. It's not going to be as efficient as what we see as the traditional civil rights movement. And that's in large part because Black Lives Matter is much more decentralized. It is not sort of dependent on the kind of charismatic leadership that we saw with the civil rights movement. Not to say that leaders of Black Lives Matter are not charismatic, right? But there's no like one organization that directs all Black Lives Matter activities throughout the country, right? It's sort of very decentralized, many sort of chapters throughout that aren't necessarily, they don't necessarily answer to some central or national organization. So I think so much of contemporary Black political activity is concentrated at the local level. It's not reliant on one or two leaders. So sometimes it can be less efficient, right? When you're not just sort of taking your marching orders from people, but you're actually like taking the time to hear all perspectives and count everybody's voices, right? And trying to sort of bring in a much wider coalition into this movement. In that sense, it's not going to be as efficient, right? It might take longer to achieve some of its goals.
We had a comment from Bobby, who was saying that in her memory during the civil rights era, we were more aware of non-religious views of artists who were very open about their skepticism, but activists, except for the most extreme, were often assumed to be religious. Was this misrepresentation by white press or downplaying deliberately by Black leaders? we have a
Mhm.
sense of what was going on?
Yeah. So I think it's probably just artists in general are often very um, kind of more open to being sort of anti-institutional, going against the grain. That's one of the reasons why I focused a lot on artists and writers and poets in this book. So I do think as a group, they're likely to just sort of buck the general trends in their society, right? Whereas political leaders do have to sort of build more coalitions and alliances with people. But nevertheless, for Black secular leaders in the 1960s and 70s, they were fairly open about their free thought. So it's just maybe it wasn't really reported on. But I mean, you had somebody like David Hilliard, who was speaking before the National Council of Black Churchmen in 1968, get up in front of a large assembled crowd of Black ministers and call them a bunch of pimps and MRFers and say that they need to get around to supporting the agenda of the Black Panthers, or the Panthers will be forced to off some of them. Right now, this wasn't something that the white press would have reported very widely, or that would have gained a lot of currency, but it is something that happened in a very public venue, and would have been available to the people who were there or in that area. Also, to anybody who was reading, papers like the Black Panther, you would have seen the sort of secularism and religious skepticism of many leaders and rank and file members of the Black Panther Party. But again, that wasn't necessarily sort of a mainstream paper, right? It's something that you generally had to be a member of the party, or at least in a community where there was a chapter of the Black Panther Party, in order to sort of have access to that publication.
Are we seeing more intersection of free thought in today's Black organizing or movements like Black Lives Matter or Black art?
Yeah, I'm not as up on Black art, although I have certainly noticed kind of an uptick of discussions and representations of Black atheists in popular culture, right? In Black shows like Blackish or Grownish or other shows, even Black films like This Christmas and whatnot. You're starting to see more and more Black atheists being represented, right? But in terms of Black Lives Matter, yes, absolutely. You are certainly seeing a lot more sort of open participation of religious skeptics and secular thinkers, right? And one of the developments that I'll be tracing in a second volume of Black Freethinkers is that you see secularism and religious skepticism more prevalent among LGBTQ identified Black people than among heterosexuals. And that's in large part because it's a population that's often discriminated against in Black churches, made to feel less than, even kicked out of Black churches. If you're a Jehovah's Witness and come home and tell your parents that you're gay or lesbian, then you're going to be ostracized from that community. So we do see more a greater prevalence of secularism among that population, and it's a population that's really in leadership positions in Black Lives Matter and much more sort of openly embraced in sort of today's Black freedom struggle than was the case in the 1960s.
There's a question about how much the leaders of the civil rights era or before or after talked about pluralism or were inviting to atheists, agnostics, other free thought identities in their movement. Do we have a sense of what those leaders thought? Were they inviting to all? Did they speak about pluralism much, or did they stick to their kind of?
Yeah, they really didn't, from what I can see. I mean, some individuals maybe, but the sort of main leaders kind of stuck to their religious positions, and it was hard for them to even reach out to other religious people, right? Like building bridges between Christians and Black Muslims, for example, was always sort of slow going, and really didn't happen very, very much. But I will say that that Black religious leaders and theologians and Black intellectuals, even if they didn't necessarily openly invite Black atheists into their movement, right, they were nevertheless influenced by some of their ideas and by a lot of their critiques of Christianity. And we can see this with the emergence of Black theology around 1966, 1967, right? Because at that point, for nearly 50 years, Black atheists and Black freethinkers more broadly had been railing against the Black church, calling it otherworldly and unsuited to addressing the needs of Black people, right? This was the case with W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote an essay on this back in 1915, to Hubert Harrison and Langston Hughes and James Baldwin and Richard Wright and Huey Newton and others. And by the mid-1960s, Black theologians actually began sort of taking these critiques seriously, even though they were coming from Black atheists and agnostics, and starting to formulate a theology that really tried to address the contemporary needs of Black people, right? So arguing, for example, that God is Black, arguing that God is on the side of the oppressed, that God will eventually, help to end racism and injustice, and even sort of, working a little bit with members of the Black Panther Party. So some Black theologians did work with Black Panther Party members. For the most part, though, in terms of actual work on the ground, you didn't see a ton of alliances, but there were those kind of intellectual influences whereby Black theologians were taking seriously some of the critiques of their religion as otherworldly.
And final question, what are your next projects? How can we look forward to more work from you?
Sure. So right now I'm writing a book on African-American Unitarian Universalists. So that chapter that I mentioned in Race, Religion, and Black Lives Matter that looks at the Black Unitarian Universalist Caucus, that's one chapter in a broader project, a broader history of Black UUs, starting in the 1740s with the earliest Black members at kind of liberal churches that would be sort of predecessors to Unitarian churches in Massachusetts. And I look at how at sort of various moments, African Americans have been either prominent or even founding members of like Universalist churches in Massachusetts and in Philadelphia. And also how Black UUs have kind of continuously tried to push their one denomination after 1961. Prior to that, there were two separate denominations, but how they've continuously tried to push religious liberals to be sort of more attuned to racial injustice and to sort of take action against racism in American society. So it starts out in the 1740s and it goes up until the recent creation of a group called Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism. So that's the sort of main project I have right now. And then my next book after that will be a second volume on Black Freethought, because this first volume goes up to about the mid-1970s, so the end of the Civil Rights era. And the second volume will pick up the story around the 1970s and take it up to basically about now, right? 2020, 2021. It's going to look at the continuing importance of Freethought and secularism to Black writers like Octavia Butler and Alice Walker and Ernest Gaines and others. And it's also going to explore this the sort of rising prominence of free thought in Black popular culture, like I just mentioned. I think I'm going to have a chapter on Black comedians, obviously a very sort of irreverent group, and people probably much more likely to be open to secularism. But one of the key sort of aspects of this is going to be tracing the institutionalization of Black free thought, right? Because earlier on you had Black freethinkers who were in political organizations, right? The African Blood Brotherhood in the 1920s, the Communist Party in the 1930s, the Black Panther Party in the 1960s. In the 1980s, though, you see that start to flip around, and you actually get the creation of specifically Black secular organizations with the founding of African Americans for Humanism in 1989, then followed up, of course, in 2011 with the founding of Black non-believers. So it's going to, that's going to be probably the kind of key theme of the second book is sort of this rising institutionalization of Black free thought and what that's meant for the number of Black secularists, as well as the sort of way they present themselves, their place in the movement, how institutionalization has sort of changed their articulation of their secular perspectives. So those are sort of the two main things I'm working on right now.
Wonderful. For those of you that don't know about Black non-believers, they're hosting an incredible conference in September in Chicago called Women of Color Beyond Belief. We are one of the sponsors of that event. We hope you all go check it out. That's being coordinated with Black Skeptics LA, which is here in Los Angeles as well.
Yep,
Christopher,
I'll
I
be
want to thank
there
you.
pending COVID. You know, we'll see what happens, but I'm registered and got my flight booked, so hopefully I'll be there.
Perfect. I'll put a link in the chat for everyone that's interested in more info on that. Christopher, I want to thank you for your time and your work. I can't imagine how many hours you put into researching these books, but it is so valuable and meaningful. So thank you.
Thank you again for having me.
Awesome. I'm going to kill the live stream. And wonderful. We can all chat for a few minutes. I know you have to run pretty quickly.
I do, yeah. We have our new student convocation for UNC Charlotte that I have to head out to. So I'm sorry I can't stay and chat with you guys, but thank you all very much for being here. I've really enjoyed your questions that you placed in the chat, and I'm happy to talk more if you want to shoot me an email. I'll put my email in the chat.
Perfect.
So feel free to shoot me an email and we can talk more. Oh, I think I just DM'd this to somebody instead of all of you. Sorry. All right,
Wonderful.
there you go.
Got it. Thank you. Well, have fun at your convocation.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Take care.
All right. All right, everyone. We're going to hang out for a bit. You have the ability to be unmuted now, but we're going to give the floor to one or two of our board members really quick to talk about nomination for our board of directors. This is technically now our general meeting. So Mark, are you up?
Hi, I'm Mark Rockoff. I'm a director at large at Atheists United. I'll just read this announcement so that everything goes well. Atheists United is a nonprofit organization with a democratically elected board. Board members serve 2-year terms. Each year, about half the board is up for election. This year, the offices up for election are president, secretary, and 3 director-at-large seats. Our nomination committee is looking for nominees. Later this week, an announcement will be emailed to everyone and posted on our website with the specific details. But here's a little bit of the information. All positions, the nominees to all positions must be active members for at least 3 months in the past year and currently hold an active membership to qualify for nomination. And the nomination process will end and the election process will begin at next month's Atheists AU live meeting. This meeting, our general meeting, they're all names of the same thing, which will be on September 26th. Nominations will also be taken from the floor on September 26th. And our Arlene Rios, our vice president, will be who you'd contact to get yourself nominated. If you want to be nominated, if you can't make it to the 26th meeting, or if you just want to get yourself nominated, you'd contact ARLENERIOS at atheistunited.org. And as always, if you want to nominate someone, please ask them if they are willing to run. Any questions? Okay. Well, as I said, a full announcement will be going out later this week. So check your emails. Maybe some contested races. So pay attention and, so you can decide about how to vote. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Cool. All right. And then we can't tell you how to vote, but there's another major election happening in California, and we encourage you to participate. That's the recall election happening right now. We cannot tell you who to vote for or what to vote for, but we sure as heck can tell you to vote. So please go vote. All right, Klaus, the meeting is yours.
All right, can you hear me? First of all, yeah, Evan, your microphone, is that new? A new microphone?
I wonder if it's still coming out of there, not here. So I'll work on that for next meeting.
It's closer to the microphone always helps. But anyway, how is everybody doing? That was a great lecture. While we are here until 1 o'clock, so it's 25 minutes, and then I have to get ready for the next adventure. Anyway, I'd like to start by a little quote that I heard recently, and it goes like this: religion created hell to make you fearful of dying, but they didn't tell you that it's impossible to burn a spirit. Yeah, thank you for the applause. Thank you. Any comments? Oh, you don't have to talk about my quote. You can talk about anything. What's going on in the news? Any religion news that you heard of? Yeah, this was very entertaining right now. Yeah, thank you. All right.
Did anyone else feel like you have to read the book to keep everything in your head of what he just said during that presentation we just had? There were so many dates and names. I was taking notes as quickly as I could so I could ask some competent questions, but
well, isn't this whole thing wasn't it recorded?
It was recorded, yeah.
So then later on, hours and hours replaying it again and taking copies of notes.
Yeah, I love history talks because they always remind me how much more I can learn. There's just always more detail than you think you could possibly learn.
Evan, is it possible to get a copy of what you recorded?
Yeah, so it's already on our Facebook. We went live on Facebook as this presented, so it should currently be viewable on our Facebook page. I'll also have a recording that I will put into YouTube over the coming weeks.
Great.
So by this time next month, you should be able to see it on our YouTube as well, and you can watch it endlessly.
It was very good. It was very good. He made some good points, brought up some memories, and
Yeah.
forecasting a bunch of stuff. And what he said is basically the tip of the iceberg. There's a hell of a lot more going on in the water than just that tip. I was trying to get that across, but he got stuck on Black Lives Matter. But yeah, it's there's never been an end to the cycle of religion, not religion, but racism in terms of trying to propel yourselves against that. That doesn't end. There's no sign in the near future that it is going to end.
Yeah, I really liked a line he said, atheism was central to politics when he talked about Black Freethought, in a way that I feel like a lot of, I don't know how many exactly, but you occasionally hear a lot of white freethinkers try to separate politics and justice movements from their atheism in a way that Black atheism has never done and can't, given like your identity in America and its history of oppression, right? Like how can you possibly remove racism from the question of all your other identities?
You can't. I mean, as a Black man growing up in Watts and during that time frame he was talking about, say from 1950 onward to now, unless you've lived it, you can try to understand it, but you don't denounce what school or church you went to, because that would basically throw you out of the community, if not physically, then socially. And that's, you can't afford to lose that. You can't afford to lose that contact. That's why barbershops are made fun of. How many Eddie Murphys have you seen doing barbershop type things in his videos, his movies? Well, that's a statement basically about how valuable that is. See, non-Black folks will get together at a park, somebody's living room and whatnot. Well, Black folks, you don't have that luxury sometimes. So you go to the barbershop and the women go to the hairdresser, and that's where you have your political social talk. All those people in there listen because you're there for just that. Then in the movies, it becomes hilarity. But in real life, you're talking about serious things. Magnificent Brothers put up at least 4 barbershops in Watts, up to 103rd Street, as well as on Crenshaw Boulevard. And that's where you went. And you talk with people that had the information, they knew about the politics, but serious conversations that you couldn't have anywhere else. And being a Black Catholic, it was always funny. You walk in the room and they say, well, you're a Catholic schoolboy. What's wrong with you? What are you doing here? The difference was the Catholic school education was far superior to the public school education. And so when I could conjugate a verb, they're saying, what's a verb? The things like disparities like that, for some of them, not all of them, but it really hits home to hear someone revisit your history and talk about what happened in other states that you already knew about. I'm surprised he didn't mention Angela Davis, because she was here with an activist in LA. Now she's teaching for UCLA. I think she's retired. Talked with her not too long ago. She's retiring, I believe, but she's still in California after she spent some time in prison with Stokely, and for saying the truth. But yeah, this was very good. I enjoyed this. This was very good. It kind of helps you because with that information, you gotta educate your kids. And that's important, very important, because you weren't, you had to live through it and then say, wait a minute. So it gets interesting. Anyway, let me get off my soapbox.
I'd love to add his book to our book club. It's a little academic for what we've been doing, but I'll see if I can talk to Sarit into adding it.
Oh, this is good.
Yeah.
Hello? Unmuted.
So, Evan, can you help the technical issues for Jeff's peoples? Everybody should be able to unmute now.
Yeah, you should be able to unmute yourself. Can everyone
If you
unmute?
click on the microphone.
Here, I'll ask him to unmute. Maybe he doesn't have a microphone.
And Mark, there was a question from Christine Breen in the chat. If you can, oh, Mark is on the phone. Okay. Can somebody help the question in the chat about the election?
Oh, yeah. So question, I could probably take a stab at those real quick. What are the qualifications for the board? So they're slightly different for officer positions. Those will be written out in the more formal announcement. For the position of president, for instance, has higher qualifications, but for general board seats, it's you must have been an active member for at least 3 months of the past year. What does the job entail? You have regular monthly board meetings. Those are often hour and a half to 2 hours. You have committees you would serve on, at least 2 board committees. Those range from a fundraising committee to a finance committee to a governance committee. And then there's expectation that you donate and give time to the organization beyond that. So we do have a whole boatload of programs that we do, and we are constantly looking for help managing those. And the board is usually our first group of volunteers to step up and support those programs. Issues the board deals with, a lot of strategy and policy. The biggest thing we're probably taking on going into 2022 is mission, vision, values. We are having conversations about if the mission statement needs updating, how we're going to articulate our values as an organization, what our main focus and budgetary needs are going to be going into 2022 and 2023. And